A dazzling 10 out of 10 wake-up call. The Dazzlings, composed of Adagio Dazzle, Aria of Blaze, and Sonic Dusk, were a group of 3 evil, magical, and beautiful sirens who came from a magical land called Equestria. When they almost conquered and divided it, a pony called Starswear the Bearded banished them to the human world, where they spent centuries. You might think that time gave them the chance to learn their lesson and realize their mistake and become better people, but you're wrong. Instead, they didn't learn anything good, and they only became worse, argued and bickered, cast spells on innocent people, fed on negative vibes from arguing people, made bad conflicts even worse, spread discord and disharmony around everywhere they went, just to name a few. But one day, they discovered that there was equestrian magic in the human world. So they came to a school called Canterlot High with the plan to use this magic to take over the world. They cast a spell on all the students, turned a friendly music competition into a battle of the bands, and eventually got the negative energy from a group of magical girls that they needed to take over the world. And they would have if it wasn't for that same group of girls, as well as an Alicorn princess, a reformed bully, and the Alicorn princess's sidekick, stopping them. Using their own magical music and the magic of friendship, they defeated the Dazzlings, destroyed their appendants, and eradicated their magic and broke their spell. But the Dazzlings still didn't learn anything. They were angry and blamed all of their problems on the Rainbooms, especially Sunset. They were currently at Canterlot Station, standing next to a shed, and planning their revenge, but they couldn't agree on anything. "Your plan's never going to work," said Aria. "Yes, it will," said Sonata. "None of your plans are going to work," said Adagio. "You should just stick to my plan." "Yeah, right," they both said. "Your plan literally backfired and led to us losing our magic and music and appendants." "Exactly. And it humiliated us too." "Oh, please. It wasn't that bad of a failure." "Hello?" The girls were startled. This voice wasn't their own, and it didn't sound like a voice they had heard before. It sounded like it was coming from the shed. They turned to it, and the voice spoke again. "I hear you girls are planning revenge." "Yeah," said Sonata. "We're planning revenge against the mean girls who destroyed our pendants, and they're the reason we lost our magic in the first place." "What?" he said. "You blamed them for that. That was your fault." "Excuse me," said Adagio. "Don't you excuse me, you little runt," the voice said. "You girls hadn't been so evil, you would still have your magic." "But, no buts," the voice said. He then said, "You know it isn't too late. You could change and move on and become better and become a valuable addition to this world." "Why on earth would we do that?" said Adagio. "Well, because there was an engine who made the same mistake you're thinking about doing, and it backfired on him big time." "Who?" they asked. The voice began speaking, and this is the story the voice told. In between the early 1960s and the late 1950s, the Class 42 warship diesel locomotives were one of the many diesels ordered and built by British Railways. But one of them had a very infamous reputation. This diesel came from a small workshop in the deep part of England. And you may not know, but it's still there even today. This workshop experimented with creating experimental engines. One was a Class 08 diesel shunter that was as fast as an A4 Pacific and ran on sugar. Another was a large crimson red Deltic with multiple clawed limbs. Another was a narrow gauge steam engine with standard gauge wheels that could run on standard gauge track. Another was an A1 Pacific with the wheels of a Black 5, the strength of a Bierstedt 9F, and the shunting capabilities of a Class 08 diesel shunter, just to name a few. But their most infamous creation was this diesel. It was a brown Class 42 warship with wasp-coloured stripes on its sides. It was made out of magic-proof steel, and it was called Diesel 10 because it was not only the workshop's 10th diesel engine, but it was also the 10th Class 42 warship built. However, its biggest peculiarity was its massive, brown, hydraulic, semi-sentient, malfunctioning claw on its roof, which was nicknamed Pinchy by the Diesel. This claw could be concealed underneath the Diesel's roof, if necessary, and it was strong enough to tear things like engines apart, lift things like trees, and cut and break through things like rock, stone, steel, coal, iron, ore, ruby, just to name a few. And it could even be used for clearing obstacles and debris, maintenance, rebuilding, disassembling, scrapping, among other things. The Diesel's driver was very lazy. In fact, the driver barely even noticed anything his engine was doing most of the time. But not long after the Diesel was built, it was sent away by to a railway that bought it, and the engine to work at the scrapyards. Of course, Diesel 10 wasn't perfect. He had anger issues and was very grumpy, stubborn, and rough. But despite that, he proved to be a hard worker and a really useful engine, who took great pride in his work at the smelters. Thanks to his claw, scrapping engines during modernization and during other parts of art and time became easier and quicker and more efficient. So much so that the scrapyard's profits were growing. And the Diesel's strength also made deliveries to and from the scrapyard easier too. However, the Diesel was only allowed to use its claw or outside the scrapyard if necessary. Every time it was outside the scrapyard, it had to keep it concealed so it wouldn't freak anyone out. But the Diesel also had a hobby of creating sculptures out of all kinds of materials, like scrap, which were then sold off to galleries and museums, even the Royal Gallery in London. And all this money that the sculptures brought in helped both the scrapyard and the railway greatly. And Diesel 10 was very proud. Diesel 10 did so well, in fact, that the manager let him go out of the scrapyard to pull heavy goods trains and pull some large express trains once in a while. At first, Diesel 10 seemed like the perfect engine. Oh, how naive could everyone be? Because not long after the Diesel had arrived on the railway, strange things began happening. First of all, many steam engines from all kinds of railways in Britain were going missing, even ones that had been preserved and hadn't been withdrawn from service. Yes. One moment they'd be minding their own business, then they would be gone without a trace. And there was also an unusual amount of scrap found at the other railway scrapyards that wasn't even there, but it had been torn apart so much that no one could identify if it had been an engine or not. And workmen that worked at the scrapyards also said that they began to notice Diesel 10's strange behavior. They say that when Diesel 10 was scrapping an engine, he always had a sadistic look in his eyes and was smiling, and seemed to take too much pleasure in doing it. He would even make the deaths as slow and as painful as he could for the engines that were being scrapped. As well, there were a few times when signalmen and workmen reported seeing Diesel 10 and rolling out of the scrapyard with his claw, or not concealed sometimes, and would always return by morning. Soon suspicion towards this Diesel grew. But soon eyewitnesses began telling very disturbing stories about this Diesel. They say that on nights they've seen him chasing steam engines. One time someone saw him chasing a Great Western engine pulling a coach and brake van that was believed to be the engine running away from scrap up down the main line. Another time, a witness said that he had seen Diesel 10 chasing after 2 Caledonian goods engines one night. And so on. Police began going to the scrapyard to see Diesel 10, but they never came back. Something wasn't right. But one day, Diesel 10 was told to take a goods train into a station near the bridge that led to Sodor. But after he delivered the goods train, he went to Sodor without permission. Why? Because he knew about an engine on that railway. This engine was called Lady. She was an engine owned by a family of conductors and station masters and had a driver called Burnett Stone. She worked on the island of Sodor and was one of the very first engines on the railway. She worked in the quarries and mountains and hills of the railway with a narrow-gauge diesel engine called Rusty. One day, she delivered a goods train to a small station and was taking a rest when Burnett went out to see the station master. But while she was resting, a man called P.T. Boomer, who was the man who bullied Burnett when he was a child and was jealous of the relationship between Burnett and a woman called Tosha, sneaked onto Lady, and then he began fiddling with Lady's controls. When he finished, Diesel 10 found Lady, but before he could make a move, he began moving because of PT fiddling with her controls. Her brakes had come off, and she began rolling onto the main line. When she woke up, it was too late. Burnett watched in horror as he saw what was going on. Lady began roaring down the main line at incredible speed, and Diesel 10 began chasing her. Lady began picking up more and more speed, but eventually she arrived at a hill and went down it, and her speed began increasing even more dangerously while Diesel 10 continued the chase. But eventually, she hit a sharp curve at the bottom and came off the rails and crashed. She was damaged severely, but before Diesel 10 or Boomer could move in for the kill, they heard an engine. Not wanting to be caught, they both fled. Especially Diesel 10. He already had tons of suspicion on his back. He didn't want any more negative publicity, or else it would blow his cover. He returned to the other railway, where he made an excuse, just that the manager believed. He said that there was a broken signal, but many years later, Diesel 10, along with his two henchmen Splatter and Dodge, were brought to the Northwestern Railway when the Fat Controller was on holiday to help out with work. While there, he caused plenty of trouble. It eventually escalated in him chasing the newly repaired and brought back up to steam Lady and Thomas, the tank engine and E2 class tank engine, across the railway and the island until they arrived at the Big Dipper, the railway's tallest viaduct. Lady and Thomas and Burnett made it across safely, but Diesel 10 wasn't so lucky, along with Boomer, who was on his roof. The bridge finally gave way, and he and Boomer fell off the viaduct into a muddy barge where they were taken away in disgrace. When Diesel, and before all of that, and before the chase, Ace, Splatter and Dodge had betrayed him, and Diesel 10, who was now humiliated, wasn't happy about it. When Sir Topham had arrived and found out about what Diesel 10 had done, he sent both him and Splatter and Dodge away in disgrace. But on their way back, Diesel 10 pretended to forgive Splatter and Dodge, but when he had the chance, he threw them into using his claw, he shoved them straight into two fuel tankers, blowing them up. And he escaped before anyone could get to the crime scene. When he was asked about it, he said they both lost control and crashed into the tankers. He tried to save them, but it was no use. But unfortunately for him, news had spread about what he had done on the island, and quickly after that, Diesel 10 was left in the shed in disgrace until the manager allowed him to work again. But one night, an engine was taking a goods train to the other railway. This engine was restored on Black 5 from a heritage railway. When it arrived, it was on its way back home when it heard something. It sounded like a diesel engine, and it was coming from a small shed. He rolled in front of the shed and was about to ask who was in there when suddenly a massive claw swung out of it, and the next morning, the engine didn't come back. As great concern grew, a crew was dispatched for a certain urgent rescue, and the workmen of the crew were horrified at what they saw. They found Diesel 10 looking as evil as ever, staring coldly down at the remains of the engine. He had torn him up into tiny pieces. When word spread, Diesel 10 was not only once again locked up in the shed, but everyone finally knew the truth. Diesel 10 had killed not only Splatter and Dodge, but all the steam engines that went missing. Now he was only allowed back on Sodor once in a while. However, a few times he did show his good side. The best example of this was when he went to Sodor to help out, and he eventually reluctantly agreed to clear the tracks next to the airport, so Thomas could get George the steamroller to come and help repair the runway. But after this good deed, Diesel 10 just went back to being a villain all over again. And the same thing repeated again, and again, and again. Every time he had the chance to change, he would always he's blow it by going back to being a villain after doing something good. The Fat Controller, Edward and even Thomas warned him that one day Karma would bite back if he didn't change, but he never listened. But he really should have. Because one fateful night, Diesel 10 was resting at the sheds, but there was an express train that was meant to be taken from the other railway to Vickerstown, and the diesel that was meant to take it had broken down. And since Diesel 10 was the only engine available, he was asked to take it, which he did. However, he had a strange feeling. He couldn't tell why, but it felt like a bunch of eyes were watching him. He arrived at the station and bothered up to the coaches. His claw was being concealed underneath his roof for obvious reasons. The passengers were hesitant about entering the coaches because of Diesel 10's past, but they eventually just walked in and then got on board. P.T. Boomer, who had taken over as the driver of Diesel 10 after his driver retired, and after the incident on Sodor, started up his engine as soon as the Data Master blew his whistle and the train was ready to go. Diesel 10 rolled out of the station, still nervous about the feeling he was currently feeling. But he didn't even notice a bunch of ghostly engines behind the station watching him. Diesel 10 was enjoying himself. The rails hummed and the coaches clattered behind him as he rolled along the main line. But as he neared the bridge that joined the mainland to Sodor, it happened. Diesel 10 heard the door on his roof open up, and his claw moved out of it. He said, "Benji, what are you doing?" But as soon as he finished, the claw slammed on his face so hard it knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, Diesel 10 was shocked. He wasn't on the main line anymore. He was in an abandoned scrapyard. It was overgrown with vegetation all around, and there were loads of trees and bushes, and all the scrap that was still there was facing towards him like it was staring at him, glaring at him, gazing at him. And all the buildings were destroyed and overgrown too. Diesel 10 was lying on his right side, and as he looked around, he saw his claw. It looked like it had been ripped off, and in the claw's jaw were the torn up pieces of his power bogey's engine and boomer, like they'd been torn apart by the claw. And his fuel tank was also leaking. Slowly. Diesel 10 was speechless, but he remained hopeful that someone would find him. So he waited, and he waited, and he waited, and he waited. The seconds turned into minutes, the minutes turned into hours, the hours turned into days, the days turned into weeks, the weeks turned into months, the months turned into years. And no one came. Why? Simple. The passengers didn't know what happened to Diesel 10. All they remember is that the train began going slower and slower until it stopped. When they looked out to see what the problem was, they saw there was no engine at the front of the train. As word spread about the incident, how did everyone react? Well, everyone was happy. The horror of the rails, who never changed his ways, was gone. The Diesel 10 out of 10 for devious deeds and brutal strength, the blast from the parts who hated steam engines, was gone forever. The scrapyard bought a new engine to help Harry and Bert, and the other railway bought another engine to do engine to help out with goods duties. And all the diesels on the railway were happy that they wouldn't have to be bossed around by Diesel 10 anymore. And all the engines on Sodor wouldn't stop talking about how great it was. As for Edward and Thomas and Sir Topham Hatt, they just aside. They tried to warn him, but he let his hatred of steam engines and arrogance get the better of him. As for Diesel 10, soon the hope that burned inside him disappeared. Every night, rain would rain down on him, in rust, causing unbelievable amounts of rust to appear on him. And bolts of lightning would hit him, damaging him severely. And one day, the oil that leaked out of his tank caught fire and burned him severely. And occasionally trees would fall on him, crushing parts of him. This went on for years. 10 agonizing years. Until one day, Diesel 10 stopped living. But one night, Thomas was taking a passenger train along his branch line. It was at night time, and he was finishing off his work. But when he arrived at the station, he immediately saw that ghost of Diesel 10 roaring down the line. But Diesel 10's face looked depressed with tears. And now, every year, week, month, and night, Diesel 10's ghost is seen rolling again as a warning to others. Every early night, late night, and midnight. And he is now remembered as an example of what happens when you don't change when you have the chance. The voice finished. Yeah, right, said Arya. That's easily the most fake story ever. I mean, a diesel with a metal claw. Do you realize how illegal that is? And if anyone even thought about doing something like that, they would not only need a lot of permission, but they would also have so many legal issues on their hands, they'd be sorry they even tried it. Yes, said Sonata. Exactly, said Adagio. And what kind of engines would... I have a name, you know. What name? They asked. Diesel 10. Their blood ran cold. They could tell the voice wasn't joking. Soon they heard the sound of a diesel engine, smelled the smell of exhaust, and felt the ground shake as a big brown BR Class 42 warship diesel locomotive, colored brown with wasp stripes on its side, rolled out of the shed. A door on its roof opened up, and its claw peered out of it. The Dazzlings were speechless and shocked. Then the engine winked at them and rolled away into the night. After that, the Dazzlings had become changed sirens. And while they still argue and bicker from time to time, they've completely moved on from their evil lives. They're now making the most of their short human lives. And have even found a morally better way to maintain their magical voices by bringing people together and absorbing their good vibes. Which is not only healthier for them, but also makes their voices even stronger. And while they sometimes do feel the urge to turn back to evil, they never themselves fall back into old habits, for they now know what happens when you don't change when you have the chance. While everyone is surprised by their change, they never ask them about it. Why ruin a good thing, they would say. However, the only people who actually bother to ask them why they changed are the Rainbooms, especially Sunza. But every time they ask them, they always say the exact same thing. We don't want to talk about it. However, the Dazzlings cannot but feel a bit of remorse and sympathy for Diesel 10. And every time they are around any form of railway track, they swear they can feel Diesel 10's presence. But they can never be certain. Remember, if you don't change when you have the chance, karma will be harsher on you. The end.